Welcome to a Rice University podcast. For more information about us, please visit our website at www.rice.edu.
Professor Barabási is a distinguished professor at Northeastern University, where he directs the Center for Complex Networks Research and holds appointments in the departments of physics, computer science, and biology, as well as in the departments of medicine, Harvard Medical School, and Brigham and Women's Hospital. He is also a member of the Center for Cancer Systems Biology at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. A Hungarian-born native of Romania, he received his master's in theoretical physics in Hungary and was awarded a PhD in 1994 at Boston University. After a year at IBM, he joined Notre Dame as an assistant professor, and in 2001 was promoted to an endowed chair and professorship. We'd all like to have that kind of success. He is the author of almost 200 published papers and book chapters and has presented over 250 papers and lectures at conferences and institutions around the world, making him certainly one of the most abundantly linked hubs in the network that deals with the science of networks. In addition to Linked, which I've already mentioned, Professor Barabási has co-edited with Mark Newman and Duncan Watts The Structure and Dynamics of Networks, published in 2006 by Princeton University Press. In July, the journal Science recognized the 10th anniversary of the discovery of scale-free networks with an issue devoted to them, which included a paper by Professor Barabási. His work on complex networks has been widely covered in the print and radio media. His achievements have been recognized by many awards and honors, among them the von Neumann Medal and Award for Computer Science in 2006, and just this year, the Cozzarelli Prize from the National Academy of Sciences. He will be speaking tonight on network science. Please join me in welcoming Professor Barabási to the podium.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you very much for the opportunity of being here. And it's my second trip to Houston, and the weather is always wonderful here. You know, we East Coaster can only kind of envy this. So indeed, tonight I would like to talk about network science. And the best way to get started is to think about different type of networks. But before we go there, let me start with the puzzle. And the puzzle is the following. There is this very simple molecule that has the properties that if it gets into your body, that is, you somehow eat it, then it essentially attaches itself to a protein that is called COX-2 in your body. And if that is successful, then it reduces inflammation, fever, and pain. It prevents heart attacks and stroke. It could also cause bleeding and ulcer. It reduces the risk of Alzheimer's and also reduces the risk of breast cancer and other type of cancers. So, which raises two questions. What is this miracle chemical that can do so many different things in your body? And how is it possible that such a simple molecule, because this is really a simple molecule when it comes to the monsters that we have within our body, that such a simple molecule can do so many things simultaneously? And the answer to the first question is very simple. This is nothing but aspirin. The second question, however, is much more complex. How can a molecule like that have so many consequences within our cells? And to understand the reason for that, let me show you a picture that probably many of you are familiar with. This is an image of a cell. This is the type of thing that you see in your Biology 101 book. Whenever you start studying the cell, you need to learn that there is a nucleus in most cells, not all. There is a cell wall, and there are lots of organelles whose name you may or may not remember, depending on how many years passed since your biology class. And, and pretty much everybody who is familiar with biology knows this picture, but I would like to argue today that this particular picture conveys just as much information as this one, which is, as this one conveys about how my watch works. What you see is essentially the back of an electronic watch, a digital watch. And if you look at it, you say, well, I see the structural features. There's a battery, there's some kind of resistance and so on. But do you really understand how this watch works by looking at that picture? And we all know what we need to understand how the watch works. the watch is really driven by a very detailed chip, essentially, an electronic circuit that allows the periodic beeping that produces the time. And in a very parallel fashion, I would argue tonight, and I'll hopefully show some examples, that the way the cell works is really hidden in the very detailed circuits within our cells. That is the network that is hidden within each of our cells that tells us who is interacting with whom and how they interact together. And there's lots of parallels at that level between a computer chip and what's happening within our cells. And certainly, any type of cell is a wonderful example of a very complicated network that nevertheless works in a very efficient manner. But the cell is not the only network that we would like to talk about tonight. Another example would be the social network. Like think about any organization, whether it's a university, whether it's a company, whether it's a group of people who know each other. The success of the organization is really determined by their people. And none of the people actually can achieve their goals alone. They really work together. That's what it means to have an organization, that people actually work together in groups or pairwise and so on. And what you see in this particular map is an example of a real organization, which is a small company, where each node corresponds to an individual within the company. And the links tell you who is communicating on a regular basis with whom. That is by email, by phone, and so on. And the colors correspond to the different departments the individuals belong to. And these maps are increasingly drawn by companies, particularly by large companies, because at the end, these codified where is the interaction taking place or where is the lack of interaction, where there should be interaction between different type of units. And there's lots of research coming out these days from the business literature how the structure of that particular network contributes to the success of a particular group within or particular unit of an organization. So we are all part of a large network, which is the social network, which is defined by our social links to colleagues, to family members, to friends, and so on. And the structure itself is just a subset of that. Of an organization is just a subset of that. At an even larger scale, you could say the organizations, the companies, are part of a large network, which is essentially the business world or the economy, if you want to call it that way. What you see on this particular map is the US biotech industry in 1988. This is kind of the early ages of the US biotech industry. Each node corresponds to a company, and the links tell you if there were any R&D or financial arrangements between the two companies, whether they tried to develop together a drug or any type of product, or they financed together something, and so on. Now, 1988, as I mentioned, it's the beginning of the US biotech industry. Let's see what happens 3 years later. And you see that a bunch of new nodes come up, there are new companies, but there are also many, many more links. So as the industry is maturing, it's forming a huge number of alliances between its partners. That is, it's making the network denser and denser. So it's growing, at the same time it's becoming denser as well. And while the standard economic theory tells you that companies only interact with the market, this mythical object out there, in reality, these pairwise interactions between companies are very, very important, and there is an increasing body of research to show that the basic hypothesis of being one market and everybody interacting with it is really fails when you start considering these pairwise these treaties and kind of discussions that these companies have, where they would offer to each other preferential treatment that would not be at the market value, for example. So why did I show these examples? I just wanted to kind of train your eye towards to this idea that there are a bunch of networks out there that apparently have nothing to do with each other. I showed you an economical network, I showed you an example of social network, I showed you an example of a biological network within our cells. And at the first sight, they have really completely unrelated. They work at completely different scales, they work with very different functions. And the question is, can we really look at them as a network, and do they have any common properties? And to do that, we first have to step back and say, how do we think about networks in the first place? And to do that, we have to go back in the history to the work of two mathematicians, Paul Erdös and Albert-Rényi. Now, many of you may have heard about Paul Erdös. Paul Erdös was this very charismatic mathematician who never really had a permanent professional or even personal home. He would really live out of a suitcase, would travel from university to university, would make this famous statement, "My brain is open, let's prove a couple of theorems," would stay about 5 days at a host, typically a mathematician, and during that time, they would actually go ahead and indeed prove a couple of theorems, and he would move on after that. Now, the 5 days is a critical period. This is how long it took him to completely wear his host down by working day and night. And then he was off to somewhere else. And since I spent a decade at Notre Dame, as Susan has mentioned, his only permanent position in the US was at Notre Dame. He was there for 6 months. He was offered permanent professorship. He moved on once again. And many years later, they asked him, how did he like Notre Dame? And he said, Notre Dame is a very nice place, but there are perhaps too many plus signs over there. So what did Erdös and his collaborator Rényi tell us about networks? Well, they said, every network is fundamentally very simple. It is made of nodes and links that connect them. But we as mathematicians have no idea how nature or the society or economy decides to connect the nodes together. So let's make up a simple hypothesis that would be interesting enough to study and would be complex enough that perhaps describes the real networks. So they said one simple hypothesis would be to assume that the nodes are randomly connected to each other. What does it mean? It means that you pick two nodes. Oops. Let's see if we can fix this. You pick two nodes, and you throw a dice, and if you get a 6, you connect them. If you don't get a 6, you move on to another pair of nodes, and you try again. If you do that for every pair of nodes in this particular picture, you may end up with a network like that. Sometimes you got a 6, and the nodes ended up being collected. Occasionally, you didn't. And you obtained something that in the literature is called the random network, because entirely we let the dice to decide who is connected to whom. Now, for a second, let's see what happens if you do that at large scale, that you have many more nodes and you start to connect them. So we start with a bunch of nodes that are disconnected from each other, and then, which means that P is equal to 0. The probability to two nodes to be connected is 0. Everybody is isolated. Then you start throwing in links. You increase this probability P. And as you put links in the system, then some pair of nodes end up being connected. And if you put enough, then you start seeing path of nodes that end up being connected. And you keep adding more and more links. And at a certain moment, these paths will start actually merging with each other, because there's a certain chance that the link between them appears. And there will be a magical moment when all of them will collapse into a large network. And this is the moment when what mathematically we say a giant component emerges. That is, a large cluster emerges. And if you keep adding more and more nodes, eventually that large cluster will absorb all the nodes that are out there in the system. Now, one of the most important discovery of Erdös and Rényi is that you don't need to put all pairs of nodes connected essentially for that to happen. But there's always a critical point at which the system will become fully connected. So if you put enough links, a magical moment will happen. In physics, we call it a phase transition, when the network will become one big blob. Now, what happens since 1960 today is that mathematicians have spent a huge amount of energy to understand that magical moment when the network emerges. But that's not what I would like to focus on today. What I would like to focus on today is one particular property of these random networks, which is what we call the degree distribution. The degree of the node is simply how many links it has. So this has degree 1 because it connects to one other node. This has degree 2, this has degree 4, and so on. And the degree distribution is only a histogram telling us how many nodes have degree 1, how many have 2, and how many have 100 in that particular network if it's large enough. And what the mathematicians have shown is that this degree distribution essentially has what we call a Poisson shape, that it's a Poisson distribution, and you can see on the main screen better, which means it has this particular form. So that's the probability of that a certain node will have exactly k links versus k. Or you could also think as being, once again, a histogram, how many nodes have degree 1, degree 2, degree 3, and so on. And what the Poisson distribution tells us that there is a prominent peak around the average degree, which means that the vast majority of the nodes have approximately the same number of links. And because this distribution decays very fast as you move away from the average, it actually decays faster than exponentially, if you want to know the mathematical term there, then it means that we are lacking nodes that would be much more connected than the average node. So there's simply no very highly connected node or nodes that have very, very few links. So what does this mean? if the society were to be random, that is, people would actually meet and become friends completely randomly, as this model indicates, then it would tell us that this would be a society of averages where most of us would have approximately the same number of friends. And it would be almost impossible to find individuals that are much more popular than the average or much less popular than the average. So it would be truly a society of the averages. Now, the question we need to ask is that, do we believe this model? And intuitively, we could say, perhaps not. Because if the molecules in my cell would randomly start interacting with each other, I'll probably drop dead right away. The reason I can continue talking is because there is some order in my cells. And that order should be somehow reflected in the structure of the network that makes that order possible as well. In the same way, if the society were to be random, you would not have this many people together in this room. The only reason you are together is because you belong to an organization that can bring people together for particular events, whether it's a lecture, whether there are classes, whether there are meetings, and so on. And that's a deviation from randomness. You're clustering together. You're meeting each other with a higher rate than you would expect randomly. So intuitively, the answer is no, these networks, the real networks, cannot be random. But as a scientist, you would like to find quantitative evidence for this non-randomness. And so in order to do that, we needed maps. We needed maps of real networks that we could explicitly study and say, what are your properties? How are you different from the random network model that Erdös-Rényi has envisioned? And our choice for finding such a map was the World Wide Web. Why the World Wide Web? Well, the name itself says it's a network. It's a web, essentially, where the nodes are the documents, the pages that we look on the web on a daily basis, and the links are the URLs that connect them. That is the thing that you can click on to go from page to another page. And it's a very large network. It's actually, this number is outdated, what you see here. It has more than 1 trillion documents now. So it's incredibly large as a network. And the reason why it was interesting for us is because it is digital, which means that you could actually map it out. How would you do that? Well, what you do is that you start from a certain web page and say, let me see where I can go from there. Then you go to those web pages, and then you say, where could I go from there? And step by step, with patience, you can actually get a map of the network. Now, that's going to take quite a bit of time. So we actually built a robot, which is a piece of software similar to what Google does, starting from a page and step by step mapping out the network. And at the end, the robot returned us a map similar to this, where each node is a web page, and each link tells you what are the web pages you can reach with one click, what are the links on that particular web page. Now, what was our expectation? We expected that this network, to a certain degree, will be random, because it's a collection of web pages put up by a wide variety of the people, some interested in sumo wrestling, other in Picasso, and yet others, let's say, in architecture and so on. So your personal interest is reflected on the page that you put up on the web, and given the differences among us, you would see lots of randomness in the process how people connect. If that would be the case, you would find that the degree distribution, at how many links point to a certain web page, for example, follow this Poisson distribution. The surprise came when we actually got the data, and instead of this Poisson, we found something that we call a power law. So what do we see here? This is a log-log plot, not a linear plot. So you see we have powers of 10 horizontally and vertically. And this is once again a histogram telling us what fraction of the web pages have 1, 10, 100 or more links. And the fact that on a log-log plot, the data seems to be lining up as a straight line indicates that the probability that the page has exactly k links goes like k to this minus gamma exponent, where gamma is about 2. K to the minus power, second power, essentially. Now, at first you would say, okay, this is a different function what you expected. Why is it so exciting? And you're right, the functional difference by itself may not be exciting, except it has some very precise meaning. Now, let me illustrate that meaning. If you were to have a random network, it would be visually very similar to the highway system of US, where each node is a city and the links are the highways connecting them together. This is a relatively uniform network where most cities have 1 or 2 highways going in and out. You don't find any major US city that would have 200 highways serving it. Doesn't make sense to build that many. And you don't find any that would not have any, at least if it's in the mainland United States. So if you were to do a histogram of how many highways are per city, it would be probably peaked around 2 or 3 and decays very fast afterwards. However, The type of distribution we found on the World Wide Web visually looks much more like the airline system of the United States, where there are many, many small airports and a few major hubs that hold these many small airports together. And everybody who has flown knows exactly what I'm talking about, how you actually have to get always through a hub to get to your destination. Now, why do we talk about hubs when it comes to the power law? Because we have a logarithmic scale here, which means that the vast majority of the nodes are here in the small degree territory. However, the power law distribution decays much slower than an exponential. The meaning of that is that you have statistically the possibility to have very, very highly connected nodes that would be otherwise forbidden in an exponential distribution. So the hubs are what we call often rare events, and you expect to have a few of them. And these are the ones that look like airports on the airline map. And on the World Wide Web, these are the Googles, the Yahoos, the Amazons, the big gorillas of the web that everybody is pretty much familiar with. Now, these networks these days are the networks that have this power law degree distribution, that what you see on the right-hand side, are called these days scale-free networks. And the scale-free term really comes from the fact that in a random network, you can pick the average node and say, most nodes are just like this, because it serves as an internal scale in the system. You don't find nodes that significantly deviate from that. So you could pick one and say, everybody is like that. However, in a power law distribution, whom would you pick as being typical? In the World Wide Web, the average degree is about 7, which means that, but in practice, it means that there are millions of pages that have less than 7 links, and there are a few that have millions of links. So is 7 characteristic? If you actually want a more mathematical explanation, it turns out that for this distribution, the second moment of the distribution is infinity. Which means that what I'm talking about is that the average degree on the World Wide Web is 7 plus minus infinity. So the error bar is really large, and it's not meaningful by any means. So that's where the scale-free term is coming from, that you cannot pick any node and say, this is the scale in the system, this is typical. It's free of such an internal scale. Now, fine, we found the World Wide Web happens to be this funny animal, which we call now scale-free networks. But is it only the World Wide Web or only the highway system? Well, let me show you another example. This is a beautiful picture, and this is actually the internet. Now, for many of us, and for me even before I started doing researches, the internet and the World Wide Web are kind of the same, but they are not really. Because the World Wide Web is this information network of how web pages connect to each other. The internet is the physical infrastructure of computers connected to each other that route your messages or the content of the web page and so on. So this is a physical network. The way to think about that, it doesn't cost any money to put a link between Rice and the Chinese university on the World Wide Web. If you were to put a cable between Rice and the Chinese university, that would be quite expensive, even with Rice's endowment. So essentially, this is an infrastructure network, yet when you look at it, you see a few major hubs holding the whole network together. And indeed, in 1999, Falutzos, and Falutzos, 3 computer scientists have looked at this map, and they also found that it has a power law degree distribution. So let me show you another example, one that is actually used to be popular in college audiences, which is the Kevin Bacon network. So I'm sure many of you have heard about that. Yeah? So this is a game that kind of been around in the 1990s, was terribly popular. Has anybody played this game here in this room? A few. So I guess it's not popular anymore, it's fair to say. Yes, I see a couple of hands up. Excellent. So you know what I'm talking about. For the rest of you, you pick Kevin Bacon and you essentially say, how could I connect any actor to him? So for example, you say Tom Cruise is connected because they played in a movie together, A Few Good Men, so he's one link away. Then you can pick, for example, Mark Myers and say, well, he's never played together with Kevin Bacon, but he played with Robert Wagner. Robert Wagner played with Kevin Bacon, and therefore, there are 2 links away. And the interesting thing about this particular game is that you can pick any actor from Hollywood, even historical actors that died perhaps before Kevin Bacon was even born, and they can be connected too. So for example, you can connect Charlie Chaplin through 3 steps, and Marilyn Monroe through 2 steps. So the reason why you can play this game is because through the movies in which they played, the actors of Hollywood, historical or today, are interconnected. And if you rebuild this network from 1890s, since the first movies have emerged till today, and we can do that because there are databases for that, You can rebuild the actor network, and then you can say how many actors have degree k, which means that they play together with k other actors. And it turns out that once again follows the power law distribution, which means that the vast majority of the actors have a very few links to other actors. These are the actors whose name you very likely don't know unless they are your cousin, because you walk out of the movie theater before their name appears on the screen. However, there are the hubs essentially, and those are that everybody knows, and we're going to come back at the end of the lecture of who those guys are. And another example has to do with the online world. We cannot omit that, of course, where we are the nodes, the users, and we can be connected by email, for example, to each other. And indeed, several universities have been mapped out. The first was at Kia University, finding out who is emailing to whom. And once again, you find a scale-free network, which means most people have a very few email connections. A few, however, have a very, very large number. And my suspicion, those are not the bosses, but the secretary of the bosses. Then there's also the kind of the equivalent of the Facebook. This is the pussokram.com. This is a Swedish Facebook equivalent, a dating web page. And there are, people can actually form many different types of contacts. They can indicate contacts, they can have friends, they can have guest books, they can have flirts, which is the equivalent of the poking essentially these days. And no matter what measure you look at, how many friends people have, you find this power law distribution. Most, not particularly popular, few, hugely popular. So there's some common theme between all these networks I showed you until now. There was the internet, World Wide Web, social networks, Hollywood. These are all man-made systems, which raises the question, is it us who do this? Is this scale-free network a result of human intervention? And that would be a good hypothesis to actually entertain, except that we have some counterexamples. And those counterexamples are within us. So what you see here is obviously the genome, but the role of the genes is really to produce the proteins, and the proteins almost never work alone. They interact with each other, and that's what we call protein-protein interactions. This is typically a binding relationship. For example, the hemoglobin molecule in your blood cell, the one that carries the oxygen, is really made of 4 different proteins that assemble together to open up and take up the oxygen and open up and release it. So that's what we call a protein-protein interaction between them, and there are lots of them within our cells. So there's one network of how the proteins interact with each other. The proteins interact with the genes. They can shut down a gene. They can activate a gene. That's another network, a protein gene network. Or if you want a more technical term, it's a regulatory network. And there is, so what's this, 7 o'clock? Many of you probably had dinner. So there's another network within your cell, which is the metabolic network that is responsible for taking the food that you have eaten and breaking it down to the components that your cells can actually consume. And that's a chemical network that is really a bunch of chemical reactions and that are catalyzed by the enzymes, by these proteins. And at the end, none of these networks are independent from each other. They all kind of connected within our cells. So the question is which network you would like to study. And the answer is you would like to study all. But you're a scientist, so you're pragmatic, and you study the one where there is data. And at the end, the best data is really available for the metabolic network. For some simple organisms like E. coli, we have a complete map of the network. And you can also look at the protein interaction network, where we don't have a complete map, but we have reasonably sized maps. And that's what I'm going to show you here on the left and right. On the left, you see the metabolic network of yeast. Yeast is an organism that is studied a lot by biologists in the lab. And on the right-hand side, you see the protein interaction network of yeast, which is how the proteins interact with each other. Every node is a protein. 2 proteins are connected if there is experimental evidence of what we call physical interaction between them. And let's look on the right-hand side for the first. I know you want to look on the left because that's moving. But essentially, you see that there are a few major hubs. There's one here, there's one there, there's one down here, several inside that are harder to see, and many, many peripheral nodes. So the surprise came that actually that we and others looked at both of these networks, and both of them have the scale-free property. So, which is kind of very interesting if you think about that, because this is not man-made network. These networks have been around as a result of an evolutionary process that took 4 billion years. And yet it turns out that the cell has right to the same underlying structure as the World Wide Web that has a history of 20 years, or the internet that has a history of maybe 4 or 5 decades only. So this is a puzzle that we have to return to. How is that possible? Before that, I will show one more example that is crucial for this talk, and that's, of course, the sex web. So the nodes are the individuals, and the links you can figure out what they are, and the question is, why do we care? Well, we care because this is the network on which AIDS is spreading, for example, or other STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. So when AIDS started to become a major problem in Europe, then the Swedes took the lead and they said, let's go ahead and interview people and find out how many sexual partners they had during the last year or during their lifetime. They asked last year because people tend to remember better what happened last year. But they also asked the lifetime cumulative number. And this is the result. It turned out that there was actually a young Frederick Lilleros, who realized that this data is actually a network data. You don't know who the sexual partners are, but you know how many, so you can do a histogram. And the results indicate that most individuals had 1 to 10 sexual partners during their lifetime. A few, however, had thousands. And these are the hubs of the sexual network. And before you start concluding that this must be true in Sweden, but it's not true here, you need to realize that actually there is data kind of showing that this is true in Britain, which is not Sweden, the last time I checked. And it's true in Africa, and it's true in the United States as well. So this is generic across essentially the globe, wherever we look at data. And so this is underlying a scale-free network, and this has very important consequence of why AIDS is spreading to the degree that it actually did. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is to summarize some of the organizing principles we know about networks, and I'm arriving to the first one, which is the scale-free property. Which the best way to think about it is that many small nodes held together by a few hubs. If you want a quantitative definition, it means that there's a power law degree distribution behind the system. But there are other organizing principles that are common across different types of networks. And one of them that gotten lots of attention in the people's imagination is the small world property, or the 6 degrees property. And the idea behind it is very simple. You pick 2 people in the society, Sarah and Peter, and you realize they don't know each other, but Sarah knows Ralph, Ralph knows Jane, Jane knows Peter. So you say, Sarah and Peter are 3 handshakes away from each other. Now that's fine, you could find paths like that. But in 1929, a Hungarian writer actually wrote a lovely little story in which he argued that everybody thinks that the universe is huge, but in reality it's really tiny. Because at the end we are very, very close to everybody in the Earth. And in 1921 in Budapest, he said, let me connect a worker in Ford's factory in Detroit to myself. And he found essentially a very short path by realizing that the worker must know his manager must know Ford himself, because Ford was still a small company those days. Ford, however, knows a big industrialist who owns lots of magazines, newspapers back then, and that guy turned out to be a tennis player who played with one of his friends, and he played with him. So anyway, so it was a short path of about 6 degrees. So in 1929, this guy wrote, I think the world is really tiny because everybody's 6 handshakes away from each other. Now, in 1967, Stanley Milgram, who was a sociologist at Harvard that day, did an experiment and found 6 degrees of separation. And actually, about 3 decades later, there was a very famous play that turned into a movie by John Guare and now became part of a popular culture, the 6 degrees property. But it's not a property of the society only. It turns out that it's a property of all different types of networks. We find it in the metabolism. You pick any 2 chemicals in the cell and you find a path of about 2 and 3 links between them. It's true on the World Wide Web. It's about 19 links. That's a bit more longer, but it's still very small compared to the trillion web pages out there, and so on. And as fascinating as the 6 degree property is, it is one of the most useless properties of networks because you don't know where that path is. I mean, it's easy to say that Barack Obama and I are actually 3 handshakes from each other. Well, where is that path? And in order to find that path, I would need to know not only who my friends are, which I think I know, but I would need to know also who my friends' friends are and who their friends are, and then you would find essentially that path. But nevertheless, it's a general organizing principles of networks that there are short paths between any pair of nodes in these large complex networks. Now, I would like to get back to the answer of why. What I tried to convince you earlier is that many real-world networks have a similar architecture, and one feature of that is the scale-free property. And what you see here is a list of networks that have been reported to have the scale-free property. And the list is terribly diverse, and it's a very large number of networks, and there are many more these days. For some of them, the evidence is shaky. For some of them, it's very, very strong. So, but yet the question is, how is it possible that so different networks converge to a similar architecture? What's the mechanism behind it? And to understand that, we have to go back to Erdös-Rényi and ask ourselves a very impolite question. What did they got wrong? Because why don't they see the hubs in a random network model? So to do that, let's kind of inspect some of the hypotheses that are behind the random network model. The first hypothesis is that I start with a certain number of nodes, n, let's say 6 billion if I want to describe the society, and then I put links between them randomly. But hidden in that hypothesis is the idea that while I'm connecting the people, the number of nodes will not change in the network. But I would claim that that's wrong. That is, in reality, most networks continuously expand by the addition of new nodes. And the best way to understand that is to think about the World Wide Web. There are about 1 trillion nodes out there. How did we get to trillion? Because in 1991, there was only one. Tim Berners-Lee's first famous web page in Geneva. And how did we go from 1 to a trillion? Well, one node at a time. People adding essentially their own web pages and contributing to the network, the whole network, and connecting to each other. So if you want to model that process, how a network emerges, you need to actually recapitulate this growth process, which means you start from a small network and you add the new node to it. Now, when you do that, you have a decision to make. Where will I connect my new node? Because I somehow have to connect to the existing network. And Erdös-Rényi, the random network model, gives a very simple prediction. It says, do it randomly. Pick any two nodes and connect to them. And I would once again argue that's wrong, because in real networks, new nodes prefer to connect to highly connected nodes. And how do we know that? Think about the World Wide Web. More than 1 trillion web pages. How many do you know personally? A few hundred? Which are the web pages that you know? Well, everybody knows Google, everybody knows Yahoo, everybody knows Amazon. Most of us tend to know the highly connected nodes, and we have no clue about the less connected nodes. So when we decide to connect, we connect to what we know, and our knowledge is biased towards the more connected nodes, and that's what we call preferential attachment. And to mathematically model it, you say, the probability to connect to a node is proportional to how many links it has, because that's the likelihood to find it. So and that's how we call preferential attachment, which means that, doesn't mean that I can never connect to a less connected node. It just means that I'm twice as likely to connect to that node versus that one, because this has 4 links and this has only 2. But I could occasionally connect to this guy as well. So let's see what happens if I grow a network with these 2 rules, growth and preferential attachment. And now the size of the node will be proportional to the number of links it has. This is a degree. And you see that as the network grows, a couple of nodes will become very large and the rest will remain small. And the reason for that is a rich gets richer mechanism. If there's a very connected node and a less connected node in the network, when a new node comes in, it will easily find the more connected node, will have difficulty finding the less connected one, and it will more likely connect to the bigger one. So therefore, bigger the node is, faster will actually grow. And indeed, if you were to continue growing this network with these 2 rules, growth and preferential attachment, you will find that it will have a power law degree distribution. It will have the hubs naturally emerging in the system. Now, one of the things we learned in the last decade is that there are lots of things that are going on in real networks. Nodes can disappear, links can disappear, links can be rewired, and so on. But as long as the network is growing, and as long as there is some preferential attachment in the system, the network will become scale-free. And that is the reason why we have so many different networks converge to the same architecture, because very little is required of them. They have to grow, and I challenge you to find a large network out there that has not came out from a growth process. All networks we see out there essentially are the result of some kind of growth process. And it's a bit challenging to understand why do we always have preferential attachment, but in many systems we can actually derive that it is there. But it's certainly what we know is that for all systems where we see the scale-free property, the preferential attachment is there. So these are not the only things that take place in the network growth and preferential attachment, but once the 2 are there, you really have to do very extreme thing to a network to make that scale-free property to disappear. So let me kind of summarize this. And hubs emerge to growth and preferential attachment, and I call this an evolutionary role. And one of the important roles that has Mother played is that it has really kind of forced us to rethink what is a good network model. And a good network model is the one that can actually recapitulate how the system has emerged in the first place. So our goal is not to draw a network that looks like the real one, but to discover the process by which the network has emerged to the structure that we see today. That is to replay the dynamics of the network. And that's why these are dynamical rules that describe the system's emergence. Now, let me show you one consequence of this particular model, which is not so good for us. It predicts that each node will increase its degree as square root of time, which is often called the first mover advantage, because one of the consequences of it is that the biggest node will always be the one who is among the first to arrive in the network. And later you arrive, less chances you are to become hub. But we know that's not true. There are examples of nodes coming in late and becoming a major hub, and Google is the best example. It came about a decade after the World Wide Web was actually introduced, and yet it's one of the biggest hubs now. So how can you come late and become nevertheless one of the biggest hubs? So this rule that we have for the simple scale-free model tells us that each node is increasing a square root of time, which means that if you came there first, you always will be the biggest one. After everybody who comes after you will be smaller than you are. In order to understand how a later node can become a hub, we need to introduce another property that I would call fitness. Fitness is the likelihood that once a node is found, that the other nodes will connect to it. So for example, in social networks, the likelihood that you meet somebody and you want to actually meet her or him once again. Or in the World Wide Web, the likelihood that you have went to a certain web page and you want to go back to that web page again, you want to save that link. So each node has a different fitness, and if you build in now fitness into the model and say that the likelihood to connect to a node is the product of the fitness and the number of links it has, then the math works out in such a way that nodes with higher fitness will grow faster. Actually, there's another exponent here. Let me not go into the details, but this will be the consequence of that. That a node can come in late, grow faster because it has a higher fitness. And let me illustrate that. So on the left-hand side, you see essentially a network where the number tells you the order in which the nodes arrived, and the color tells you the fitness that the node had when it arrived. And you will see that it will not be the first node that will become the hub, but the sixth one in this particular example, because it had a higher fitness and it has overgrown the rest of the nodes. There is a consequence of the fitness that depending on how you choose the fitnesses for the nodes, in some cases, a very weird situation could emerge. And let me run this one again. And that's one shown in the right-hand side, where if one node has much higher fitness than the rest of them, it can simply overcome the network and become a hub that is hugely interconnected and everybody connects to that. In a technical language, we say that the Bose-Einstein condensation happens because this model maps exactly into what we call a Bose-Einstein model in physics. In a lay language, this is like Microsoft, where the network is growing, the number of computer users are growing, but Microsoft always have an 85% coverage of the market. While in a normal scale-free network, the biggest hub will always lose its market share, essentially. Even though it becomes bigger as the market is growing slower than that. So anyway, let me summarize that. So there is competition in networks, and it means that nodes with high fitness become hubs. So the fitness actually is important in this context. Now, the next question comes up is, so what? That is, why does it matter that we have a scale-free network? And there are lots of consequences of the scale-free property, and let me actually spell out one. And that has to do with the concept of robustness. What is robustness? Robustness is the ability of a system to maintain its basic functions despite the fact that a couple of the nodes are not functional. And as I'm talking to you, there are perhaps millions of errors within my cells, and I don't notice it. In the same way, we know for a fact that on the internet at any moment, hundreds of routers are not working. That means that they're broken for 5 minutes or they're broken for a day and nobody notices them. Sooner or later they will be fixed, but yet the internet as a whole doesn't collapse. So how can we think about the robustness of a complex system in the context of networks? And that's the question that I would like you to go after here. And the best way to do that is to start with a small network and ask the question, what happens if a couple of nodes break down? Well, this is what could happen to that. The network could break into pieces that don't connect anymore to each other, and that's not good news. Well, it turns out that if the network is random, or a regular network would be like a square lattice, then we have a very precise answer to what happens to the network if the nodes are breaking down. And this is summarized over here. Let me walk you through. This is the fraction of the nodes that I randomly removed, that I knocked out by chance. And S is the size of the largest component. That is how many nodes are still together in the network, that they are not isolated from the big network. And what percolation theory tells us is that if you don't remove only a few nodes, not a problem. But if you start removing more and more nodes, you will always reach a critical point at which the network will fall apart. It's inevitable. And that moment will not happen when you remove all the nodes, but it will happen before that. And there is, in the physics language, a phase transition will take place in the system. That it will go from a connected state to a completely disconnected state. Now, what happens if you do that for a scale-free network and not for a random network? So this is the same plot that I showed you earlier. So if we start playing that for a scale-free network, you get a curve like that, which doesn't look too interesting, but it actually has a very precise meaning. It turns out, and that's now mathematically proven exactly, that for a scale-free network, the critical point is exactly 1. And what does that mean? It means that you can remove 95% of the network, and the remaining 5% are still hanging together and talking to each other. It doesn't have a finite critical point. And let me illustrate that. So we start from for the network that we built earlier, and we start randomly removing the nodes. And it's a bit like the airline system. What happens if you randomly shut down airports? Well, you're most likely going to shut down the small airports because there are only a few hubs, and your chances of hitting a hub is very low if you are truly picking the nodes randomly. So you are shrinking the network, but you're not destroying it. And you see, I removed about, let's say, 20 to 23 nodes out of about 40 that I had originally, and yet the network is all interconnected. So, but there is a price you pay for that. And the price really comes in what happens if you are not removing randomly the nodes, but you start with the hubs. You start with the biggest hub, the next biggest hub, and so on. And this is what I will call attack. And then the critical point returns very, very fast. And let me illustrate that. So we start from this network. We start removing the biggest hub, the next biggest hub, the next one, and so on. And you will see that while on the right-hand side, I removed 23 nodes, and the remaining nodes are still together, on the left-hand side, I removed 12 nodes, and the network is broken into tiny pieces. This is what we call the robustness property, or the Achilles heel of scale-free networks. They are very robust to random failures, but they are extremely fragile to attacks. That is, if you know exactly how the network looks like, you can destroy it very easily. And this seems to be a property of very, very large classes of networks. Sometimes this is bad news, like in the case of the internet, because it gives you a recipe how to take it out. Sometimes it's good news in case of the cell, because it takes your recipe, for example, how you take a malignant cell out or a bacteria out. So depending on what application you have in mind, this could be good news or bad news. Irrelevant whether this is good news or bad, irrespective of whether it's good news or bad news, it's a fundamental property of these large-scale free networks. And the last issue that I would like to discuss has to do with the concept of communities and modularity. So what do I mean by that? We know that people who have similar interests tend to know each other. People belong to the same department and so on. So there are groups of people in the society that tend to know each other much more likely than to a random person. In the same on the World Wide Web, pages of similar content tend to connect to each other and so on. And this is what we call modularity, that there are groups of nodes that are interconnected much more so than you would expect randomly. And it's a property of networks in general, of a very wide number of networks, but there's a problem with that. Because I tried to convince you until now that many networks are scale-free, which means that I have a few major hubs that hold many, many small nodes together. But now I'm trying to convince you that I have relatively isolated modules that work independently from the other modules. So how can I reconcile the modules and the scale-freeness? And it turns out you can. And to do that, I will show you just a toy model to give you an idea. I will start with a small module, then I create 4 copies of that and connect to the existing one, and then I repeat that process. And I built a network that is scale-free because I have a major hub, and then I have another hub there, and so on. And actually, the math shows this is a scale-free network, but it's fundamentally hierarchical. And it's modular at many, many levels. They are made of small modules that form larger modules, and so on. And one of the things we learned in the last few years is that many real networks have this property. There are certain mathematical signatures that I will not go through of a hierarchy like that, and that is found from a wide range of networks, from the World Wide Web to the cell to social networks. But one of the most exciting questions these days in network science is that how do you find the modules? That is, if you are given a network, how you identify them? Because often a network looks like that. And this is actually the call network of several thousand individuals who talk with each other on the cell phone. And where do you find the modules? And actually, a whole industry has grown up within network theory of identifying the modules within the networks. And that has important consequences. And what I'm going to do is to show you a module that has been picked out from this one. So this is actually not one, actually, but 4 different modules that one of these methods actually is finding. This is actually developed by one of my postdocs. And you see there's a module here, there's another one there, there's another group of people who interact mostly with each other here and there. And the most interesting thing is that once you find entirely from the network topology these modules, you realize that the temporal interaction between the people really follows these modules. So let me show you how. So I'm going to show you the time in an hourly fashion. Okay, I think I started this one. Let's see if it's going to work. Let's try again. All right. I guess the video is not successful. Let me go to the next slide that shows you. So on the left-hand side, you see the module, the same network, and the right-hand side, the same network. But it shows you where the communication happening at midnight and where it's happening at noontime. And you see that while at midnight, much of the communication is happening in this community, at noontime, much of the communication happening here and there, and these people seem to be sleeping. So indeed, the communities that we are finding entirely by looking who is talking to whom also map into the temporal aspects of when the communication is happening. Most likely, these are young people who tend to actually hang around during the night, and that's their friendship circle. These are actually their parents who tend to go to work, but they actually form family and professional links, and the dish is active at noon, much more so than during the night. So let me summarize it that groups are discoverable in social networks. Now, what I would like to do in the last 2 or 3 slides is to give you an idea of what has happened in network science and where it's really kind of coming from. And that's, of course, a big challenge. But from my perspective, network science is a natural continuation of a pursuit that has happened both in physics and many other areas that are often called complexity. That is the desire to understand complex systems and the concept of complexity in many, many different areas. And network science is not the first manifestation of that. Actually, and I will try to show you now a couple of waves that really dominated our thinking about complex systems and how they stack up against each other. So this is an interesting plot because what you see here is on horizontal years, vertically is the number of citations the defining papers in the particular area have gotten each year. So this is number of citations per year, so let me walk you through the first one. The first paper everybody has heard about. This is the famous butterfly effect paper. This is the one that introduced the concept of chaos into the scientific community that in the 1960s and 70s has really dominated the community that was interested about complexity. And you see that it was published in 1963. For a decade, nobody cited it. There are 0 citations. And in 1975 or so, it was finally discovered. And since then, it's getting every year more and more citations. Last year, actually, Ted Lawrence died. And so there was a kind of further increase in the citations. But it's getting about 300 citations now these days. So it's one of the most cited papers ever written in complexity. The other 2 is this is the renormalization group that Wilson introduced, got the Nobel Prize for it, I think, in '83. And then the other one is the so-called bifurcation diagram that also it's a key paper in chaos. So you see that each of these papers are very, very cited, and they kind of are similar to each other in citations with some differences. 1980s, much of the thinking about complexity has shifted towards fractals and what we call essentially neural networks. And what the new lines have emerged essentially are how many citations each of these papers that introduced these concepts got. For example, this is a famous paper by Hopfield that introduced the neural net, so-called Hopfield model and so on. And what you see is that they are in the same ballpark, which means the same community has been shifting now from chaos towards fractals and other problems. New people came in and so on. So at the end of 1990s and 2000, essentially came probably the 3 papers that defined network science in the modern realization of that. And this is how they compare to the rest. So, and the question is, what is going on? Because obviously it's happening at a completely different scale than what we have been seeing about complex systems in general. And what is network science in the first place? And there have been many attempts to answer that. So actually the National Academy and the National Research Council has put together 2 different panels and put out 2 different reports to try to define what network science is. And the answers that are coming up is that it's an attempt to understand networks emerging in nature, technology, and society using a unified set of tools and principles. But the question is, you can try to use a unified set, but why can you do that? And the reason is really what is the new here is that despite the apparent differences between these different networks, many networks emerge and evolve driven by a fundamental set of laws and mechanisms. That is the similarity between these different type of networks that really driving the common interdisciplinary interest in this area. And that's perhaps the reason why that curve essentially shot up so much. And what I try to do today is to focus on one property in particular, the scale-free property, that lots of different networks share. But it's not the only property that is shared by that. But nevertheless, it's an indication of how so many different networks can actually converge to a similar architecture, which is quite amazing if you think about that. And at the very end, I think I owe you an answer. And that is that, why Kevin Bacon? And Kevin Bacon is certainly a prominent actor, sorry. Here you are. It played in 46 movies. It played together with 1,800 other actors, so that shows why it's so easy to connect them. And the average separation between himself and anybody out there any other actor there is about 2.79. So that's just so easy to play the game, because it's really between 2 or 3 links to everybody else. But then actually we said, well, maybe it's the number of movies that played in actually that really determines how interconnected you are. So we first created a list of who are the actors who played in the most movies? And I don't have this list, unfortunately, here, but it was an amazing list because we could not recognize any name on that list. So we started digging who the heck these people are. And one of them actually turned out to be the voice of a very famous cartoon character. I don't remember which one. And the other 9 was completely unknown. And it turned out sooner or later that they actually were all porno stars. So obviously the number of movies don't correlate with your centrality in Hollywood. So then we created a list of who are the most connected actors in the sense that they have the smallest distance to everybody else. And number 1 was Rod Steiger, number 2 Donald Pleasence, Martin Sheen, and so on. And we looked at the first 12, and then Kevin Bacon was not there. And then we looked at the first 50, and Kevin Bacon was not there. And the first 100, and he was not there. So eventually we found him in the 876th position. So why do we play the Kevin Bacon game? Because the guys who came up with the claim were watching a Kevin Bacon movie in that moment. And that's how they started it, and they went to a TV show, and then it became a Kevin Bacon game. But in reality, if you think of the biggest hub on the network, it would be like Bob Steiger, number 2 Donald Pleasence, number 3 Martin Sheen. You would need essentially a magnifying glass to find that network, Kevin Bacon. So finally, I'm going to leave you with a list of some of my collaborators who have helped me do the research going to this talk, and many of our papers are on our website, and thank you very much for your attention.
All right, well, Professor Barabási has agreed to take some questions, and I'm sure you will have some after that fantastic and wide-ranging lecture. But now, if you will wait, we have microphone runners, because we want to hear your question, and this is being videotaped, so people can watch it later. So just raise your hand, and why don't we start down here, and then we'll kind of rotate across. Okay.
On one of the near the end slides, you had language. And I just wasn't sure what aspect of language it was. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. This was the slide probably you have in mind. There have been a number of ways people have actually constructed the kind of networks out of language. One of them had to do with synonyms, simply connecting the words in the dictionary that are listed as synonyms. The other, the most common one, is contextual. That is, they connected the words that come after each other or they appear in the same sentence and so on. And there were some other lexical ways of doing that. So each of the cases, they found the scale-free property there as well. So it's rather universal in the language. And language turns out to be one of the data that people like to study because it's so easy to get the data. You either can go to the electronic dictionary, or you can take Moby Dick and simply find out what word is next to what. And obviously, who are the hops? The, a, and so on are the hops. but that supposedly contains some lexical relationship, who is after what.
The network that you showed here, mostly with World Wide Web, Internet, had definitely tremendous similarities with the network we see in the proteins in the cells. But when it comes to the cells and the protein networks, there is another very important basics in the connection lines between the proteins. When you cut some of the connections, then you essentially destroy all the network. Although you have all the hubs over there and everything's there, but when you in the World Wide Web, I doubt if you have like preferential between two different connections. But in the protein networks, I think connections are very important. Is it possible to fit this in the models that we have?
Sure. If I give a talk to more biology audience, I actually show a result that we obtained in 2001. In the case of the cell, it's a wonderful kind of tool to play with because, let's say for yeast, each of the proteins have been knocked out one by one, and you know whether that each protein is essential or not. That is, in its absence, can the yeast survive or it cannot survive? It's going to be dead. So what we found in 2001 was that there is a correlation between the hops and essentially essentiality. That is, more connected a node is, then more likely that it will more likely it will be essential, and it's a rather strong correlation. People have actually taken it to new levels, so there seems to be a correlation also between the hop status and the evolutionary speed or the number of mutations in that a protein can have, and it's an inverse correlation here. More of a hub a node is, a protein is, less likely that it will actually absorb mutations because, if you have a mutation, it will destroy the cell's ability to survive, so there's a counter-selection against them. There was some data recently to show that there is the number of phenotypic consequences of a node removal if it's a hub is much larger. But there is also counterintuitive results. One of them is that the hubs are not disease-related. That is, that not related in humans. The hubs are not associated with heritable diseases. And there's actually a huge paucity of the hubs in the heritable diseases. And the reason for that is a very funny one. If there is a mutation in the hub that is essential, that affects the essential properties of the hub, that cannot be inherited because you typically die before you could have a kid. So evolution essentially pushes out the mutations from the population that are lethal. Because you cannot reproduce, you typically don't live long enough to reproduce. So, but there is lots of evidence now that there is a correlation between how interconnected the node is and different biological functions of a particular gene or protein.
Thank you. I have two questions, and you could choose either one to answer. One is, what's your explanation for why we discover the same architecture occurring throughout all of these network systems? And the other is, okay, so what? What are the implications of this? What is this? What is some practical knowledge that comes from this that might make a difference in our ordinary lives?
The why I tried to answer here a bit was that it has to do with the fact that all networks have emerged to growth. And there's evidence that for all of these networks, there's preferential attachment. That's tricky. It requires a longer explanation. Why is it there? But there's an explanation. And as long as these two are there, then the network has to converge to this state. So it's a very minimal condition need to be satisfied that seem to be satisfied in all these networks. The practical consequences, on one end, this year, as was mentioned earlier, we are celebrating the 10-year anniversary of, to a certain degree, network science, but kind of the modern wave of network science. Because if you think about it, sociology networks were there for 50 years and other areas even longer. But so it's perhaps too early to say I have the device that is based on network science. But there are lots of consequences, and one of them comes in epidemiology that is being used, and there are several others as well. The epidemiological one has to do with the fact that it was Alessandro Vespignani, who's now at IU Bloomington, who discovered that if an epidemic is trying to spread, the basic epidemic theory tells us that if it's not particularly viral in the virus, it will die out with the host. If it's over a threshold, it will spread. So the reason why we are actually told to wear condoms is partly because it protects us. but it also lowers the spreading rates of AIDS, for example. And the hope is that if enough people use condoms, it will put AIDS under the threshold, they will naturally die out. Now, the problem with AIDS is that it never really happened that. And despite the fact that it's a very slowly spreading virus, I'm not going to try to give ideas here, but it requires about 200 sexual intercourses to pass on the virus. So it's not easy to pass it on. And yet, it's a major pandemic. And Alessandro Vespignani actually had this very fundamental paper in 2001 in which he showed that that picture is true in a random network, but in a scale-free network, because of the hubs, the epidemic threshold is always 0, which means that even weakly virulent viruses can actually spread. So this is one of the things that has completely changed the way we think about spreading processes, both for computer viruses and of biological viruses. But it has also led to methodologies of how to stop it. Because, for example, many years ago in a different administration, US has given lots of money to Africa to give it to mothers with children. Politically correct, sounds very good. One of the things we learned from network science is that's the most useless way of using essentially the same number of doses of cures. You should have really given to the prostitutes. Politically very incorrect, But that's what you need to do, because all the modeling is showing is that if you actually cure the hubs as much as possible, then you actually can restore the epidemic threshold. So we went from understanding the network structure to understanding how the network structure affects the dynamics of the spreading process to the consequence of that and how you actually try to fix that. So this is one example where the war route has been played through, but there's some other examples as well.
Question for quite a while, and I've always wondered, in the network models, is there any significance between the distance between the nodules? Because you see some of the models where they're all very tightly packed, and one's on the edge. Why is that? Is that just an organization thing, or? So
that one, what you see on the pictures is a consequence of the fact that the network visualization tools always put the nodes that are interconnected, tend to put them together because they look better. That doesn't mean that they are actually close to each other. In some networks, like in the mobile network, we know where people are when they make phone calls, and they could be in another part of the country. So that's really just a visualization feature. If you would not do that, you would see a mess. So the difference is really between, well, let me just go back very briefly. I guess I cannot do that here, but, I guess I'm going too fast. Even this one was laid out essentially with such a software, but imagine that if you put the nodes completely randomly, then you would just see a gray area everywhere so the software that is used to visualize this network tries to pull them together if they are interconnected. Now, in reality, however, there is lots of evidence that nodes that are physically close to each other are much more likely to interact than those that are far away. So, for example, there's data in social networks. We have this magical 10-kilometer result. That is to say that if you and I are made, the place that we spend most of our time is less than 10 kilometers and we know each other, then we are likely to meet face to face. If the distance is more than 10 kilometers between you and I, even though we talk on the phone, we never actually meet physically. So there's actually lots of space type of results that are coming out now that the data is becoming more precise. But this one is just a visualization thing.
Very much. You talked about a lot of different kind of networks, but I was wondering about the one that a lot of us here are interested in, and that is the human brain. What does network science have to say about the connectivity of the human brain, and how do your results and findings apply to it?
Sure. That's a wonderful question. When I wrote my book, I had originally planned a chapter on the human brain. When I got to write it down, I realized we don't know anything about that. And the reason we don't know anything about it, so I had to scrap that chapter, is because we don't have maps. We don't know how the neural level, essentially, the brain is interconnected. The biggest organism that has been mapped out at the neural level is the C. elegans, which is not a particularly smart animal, has only 300 neurons. And those are genetically predetermined who is going to connect. Each C. elegans connects exactly the same way. So there is no smart C. elegans and dumb C. elegans. They're all equally smart. So the lack of maps is really what stops us from saying anything. Now, there are a number of functional maps, which is people put electrodes on the patient's head, 250 electrodes, and say what region of the brain lights up together with the other one. And if you generate maps from that, they are all scale-free. People use MRI to generate different kind of activity maps, once again, they all find the scale-free property. What has happened, however, in the last kind of decade is partly because of the push on the network field, was that I think neurologists have realized the importance of these maps. And if I understand right now, there is a deadline looming for a very, very large grant by NIH where people actually come together to create maps. That is to develop the technologies to map at the neural level mammalian brains out. And now there are a couple of technologies that are typically based on slicing and visualization and reconstruction with the computer to get neural level maps of a certain region of the brain. And I think we're going to see major advances in the next few years once the maps will become available. Right now, as much as everybody knows that the human brain is a kind of a large network, we don't know about its interconnectivity.
Thank you.
Thank you. The question that I have is, most of the results we have seen are for networks which are simple. Nodes are connected with links, but you don't allow parallel links or loops. And from an engineering perspective and redundancy perspective, parallel links are desirable. So what can you tell us about these more complex systems?
Yes, so I kind of focus indeed on the simple networks. You could also say, why didn't I consider the weights of the links, which are very important? Why didn't I consider the directivity of the links? And all of these are actually being considered. And there are a set of tools that you would generalize from the simple network that I showed here to the weighted network or directed networks and so on. There's huge differences in detail, but there's nothing conceptually new in them. So that it's kind of, yes, it's important. So for example, the World Wide Web is a directed network. What does it mean? The degree distribution, both for the incoming and the outgoing degrees, is actually not exactly the same, but both of them follow a power law. The weights typically are power law distributed as well. So if you look at the weights of how people talk, how often they talk to each other, and you kind of say, what's the distribution of that? That's again the power law. And it turns out to be very strongly correlated with the network topology and so on. So there has been a lot of results, and I could probably give you a couple of weeks long course to go through all of them. They are fascinating on their own, and if you have a particular application in mind where you have directions, where you have weights, you must look at them because they really help you to extract much more information from the system. But they haven't really contributed like one of these organizing principles that we're talking about.
So you mentioned how a scale-free network is more robust because any given node is less likely to have many connections, and there's a few with many connections. And so one question from an evolutionary standpoint is how you can change a node with many connections. How can you perturb that? And one way that biology does that is through differentiation. So you have one node that's really important. You can have differentiation of function between cells. And so I was just wondering, so that could build a new network at a new level. And so I was wondering how you can go, have you incorporated that type of network building process into any models?
I didn't, but actually other people did. And the reason this came up is there was a fundamental question, why the heck is the cell scale free? Because at the end, you don't have a contest of a new gene coming in and saying, oh, I'm going to connect to the more connected gene because that's cool. So it was a really fundamental question. You could have gone any other way around. And it turned out that there were actually 4 groups pretty much during the same summer came up with the same answer, that the reason why the cellular network is scale-free has to do with gene duplication. That is that the way you get new genes into your cell is by having the mistake of copying the existing gene several times into the genome. And if that is a successful copy, that is the cell will not die right away as a result, then it can live on, and then it will start the differentiation process that you're talking about, that they will start essentially losing some of the links. It's very hard to make new links in the cell, but you can lose the existing ones. So as a result, through these gene duplication models, the differentiation has been built in, and that's a very important part because that's how you start distinguishing the otherwise identical genes that are originally identical. I cannot say many more other than that they have been included. They are essential to the mathematical analysis of the model, but I can't say any revelation that came out of that. They are there. The process is in there. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Laszlo. And I want to thank Laszlo for coming, for giving a very memorable Bachner that in best Scientia fashion covered so many disciplines and offered a great deal of insight and understanding. His work has just been tremendously useful for my own, where cities follow rank size distributions that are power law distributions, and we never really understood why, and we have a better understanding now thanks to the work he did. Thank you all for coming, and if you have additional questions, and just conversational gambits, please come and share them with us at the reception outside. And we will hope to see you at our next Scientia lecture on December 1st, when our own Rich Baranuk will be talking about the Connections Project and Webs of Knowledge. So thank you all again. Thank you, Laszlo.
This program is protected by copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice University Digital Media Services.